Hello everyone and welcome to this discussion of climate misinformation in the UK media, hosted by Better Media. Thanks for coming. The UK media has a problem with climate misinformation, and it's a very current problem, as recent carbon brief reporting showed. As an example, The Sun produced more editorials that were in favour of fracking in 2022 than any UK paper has since Carbon Brief started tracking that information about a decade ago. Which is impressive to say the least. Over on the BBC, for example, just last week, Nick Robinson was called out for making some very misleading claims on the Today programme about North Sea oil and gas. In relation to those kinds of things that have been happening and some discussions that were had last year, we brought together a few folks who are interested in and expert in this issue in climate misinformation in the UK media to talk with us today. I'd just like to mention also Dr. Aaron Thierry, who couldn't be with us today, but whose Twitter thread was the starting point for the discussion that led to this event. I recommend following Aaron and his work. I'll just speak very briefly about Better Media. So I'm here on behalf of Better Media, which is a member-based campaigning organisation who campaign about media reform. I'll say a bit more about how you can get involved in what we do at the end. But yeah, do look us up if you're not familiar. And our guests today are Eliz Mizon, who's a journalist with the Bristol Cable and elsewhere, who's written some very interesting and incisive journalism about climate misinformation in the UK media, in the Byline Times and in other places. We also have Donnachadh McCarthy, who's the climate correspondent or a climate correspondent at The Independent, and has a long career of both engaging in climate activism, as I understand it, and reporting on climate issues. And we have Rob Watson, who's the host of Decentred Media, who platform community media projects of various kinds, and is also recording this for future broadcast potentially for us. So thank you to all of you for being here, and thanks to our viewers for joining us. I'm now going to throw to Eliz to get us started with the discussion. Thanks, Eliz.
Thanks, Warren. Hi, everyone. I'm Eliz Mizon. I do currently work for the Bristol Cable. I'm actually not a journalist at the Cable. I'm the communications lead, but I have been a journalist. And last year I was working freelance. And one of the things that I was working on was climate misinformation in the media and all of the different forms of that. And I talked to quite a few journalists who had written articles that were, either misinformation, disinformation, and kind of came up with a piece for Byline, which noted all this down. The three things that I had written about in terms of the kind of form that this takes was climate dismissal, climate denial, and climate delayism. And that I suppose my central thesis was that, like, basically all newspapers, all national newspapers in the UK are engaging in some form of dismissal, denial, and delayism in some way, even those papers that are doing a much better job nowadays of reporting on the climate crisis. So one of the first things that I found really was that, journalists are generally representative of the larger population in the way that they think about climate change. We know that journalists are not representative of the population as a whole in terms of demographics, especially in terms of class. But generally, the vast majority of journalists, like the vast majority of the population, recognise the climate crisis. They recognise that climate change is very much happening and an urgent issue, but that doesn't necessarily translate to their coverage. And so there is a huge amount of self-censorship that goes on. One of the anonymous sources that I spoke to, who is a Red Top reporter, discussed the fact the article that I wrote for Byline was in the summer last year, and you'll remember that was when we hit 40 degrees centigrade for the first time in the UK. We had a couple of really bad heat waves, and that reporter had written a piece about the wildfires that had happened in the UK because of the heat wave and the temperature, but hadn't once mentioned the climate crisis. So I asked that reporter, do you believe quote unquote, that climate change is real and that climate change is happening. And they said, yes, of course, I'm not an idiot. I can read and I understand what's happening. But if I were to pitch this to my editor, I wouldn't even get halfway through the sentence. There'd just be no point, because that isn't what our paper covers. That's not the way that we cover weather. And another Red Top reporter that I spoke to very much framed it in terms of weather and not climate change. So they report on weather, and that is something that I had termed climate dismissal. Then we moved into things like climate denial, outright denial. A lot of newspapers and broadcasters will say now, well, we don't do climate denial anymore. The BBC very famously said that they wouldn't require any climate deniers for balance in 2018, but they have still platformed people who are rubbishing climate science and who are promoting climate denial, such as Julia Hartley-Brewer recently on Question Time. She said, we don't need to worry about climate change. It's not a big issue. She explicitly said those things. And so, the BBC is still platforming climate deniers. There's a huge question of editorial power here, that journalists themselves, we think of journalists usually as the sort of famous columnists, the people with the byline image and the outrageous titles, whereas actually the vast majority of journalists in the UK, and this is another thing that I've written about, are paid incredibly poorly. The vast majority are earning less than £25,000 a year. £25,000 a year for a particularly regional journalist, anybody outside of London, not working for a national, is a good salary. So, these are people who don't have a huge amount of power. And so it really is going to require change at an editorial level if we really want to get rid of climate denial. And ownership level, and the media ownership is something that I think Donnachadh will be able to speak to really well shortly. So one of the things, I'll just go briefly away from the research that I've done into some research that Carbon Brief has done. And Carbon Brief is, for anybody who doesn't know, a really brilliant publication that essentially communicates in a sort of really accessible and easily understandable way some pretty complex climate science, pretty complex papers that come out, the academic work that's come out of the UN, for example, and they really do a lot of great work, and they are very objective and journalistic, and they protect that part really carefully. Leo Hickman, who's the editor of Carbon Brief, was one of the people I spoke to for my byline article. They did a big study on editorials in the national newspapers in the UK over a period of 10 years. It was from 2011 to 2021. And what they found was that in 2011, right-leaning newspapers published 5 editorials arguing for less climate action and just 1 calling for more, which is a ratio of 5 to 1 against climate action. And that 10 years later, by 2021, 7 editorials calling for less action on climate were outweighed by 65 supporting climate policy. So a ratio of 1 to 9 in favour of climate policy or climate action in some way. So that's a pretty huge change for right-leaning newspapers in the UK over that 10-year period. One of the quotes that I've got in my notes from that study says, "No editorials have undermined or questioned climate science since 2018 in the Telegraph." So that was the last time of all the editorials that they looked at that it was actually in any way kind of climate denying. That said, editorials, which is the kind of official stance of the paper and appears, in the first few pages of the paper, editorials and columnists are very, very different. And in 2022, in the summer last year, 2 of the things that I wrote about were a column in the Express where James Whale said the climate crisis is hot air and that planets move and we've been getting closer to the sun for thousands of years, and that's why the weather is as it is, which is bullshit, frankly. And Melanie Phillips in the Times a few days later said there is no evidence that anything is happening to the world's climate outside of historical fluctuations, which is also factually incorrect. And both of those columnists got those quotes past editors. And, in 2022, I think any editor who is saying, oh, yeah, we don't do climate denial anymore needs to be really, really careful of what they're actually doing, because either they're not doing their job very well and these things are slipping past them, or they're aware that it's happening and they're lying about it. So it is very much still happening. The third thing that I looked at, so dismissal, denial, and then delayism. So there are papers like The Guardian, for example, who are doing a good job on climate. They are committed to reporting on climate. There's lots of things to say in terms of criticizing papers that are, more left-leaning and more kind of realistic about the climate science, let's say. And one of those things is that they still carry adverts for airlines and, big giant SUV cars and things like that. So even papers like The Guardian are still carrying, the best holidays that you can fly to this summer, even as they are saying, that we are in desperate need of energy reduction, energy demand reduction, among the general population. So there is a real delayism there of any kind of serious, attention to the fact that we need to be thinking very seriously about how we change the whole system. And I think that is something that's very interesting, that even people who are doing a really great job are still engaged in some of the kind of behaviors and attitudes that we really need to change on the whole. And so I think really the central thing that I'm trying to get across is that, journalists are just people, funnily enough, and they are, doing what the rest of the general population is doing, which is, probably quite worried about it, but not necessarily taking the action that's necessary. The last thing that I wanted to say was that after Carbon Brief did their study of 2011 to 2021 and the editorials, they also just a few weeks ago released a sort of similar mini study of coverage of the climate in 2022. So it was a kind of a follow-up. And they looked at 400 climate and energy related editorials published across the year. And they noticed that actually, because of the cost of living crisis, particularly the energy crisis, that had really pushed right-leaning newspapers to push for fossil fuel extraction again. And they were quite bold-faced about, particularly The Sun, as Rowan mentioned, fracking, being pro-fracking, which so many people had already kind of shut down as though it was just a dead industry. And they were very, very hard lobbying for bringing fracking back in. And there was also an increase in coverage arguing for nuclear as really the only solution, with renewables and the decrease of energy demand, dipping in levels of coverage across the board. There was a huge increase also which everyone will have seen in articles that were criticizing protesters and people who were speaking out about the climate crisis and the level of action that's needed. So I think that there's a lot to think about, and I think that there is a lot of nuance in there. I think a lot of people just saying, "Oh, journalists don't care about the climate crisis and none of them believe that it's real," it's inaccurate. But I think that the media as a whole, particularly at editorial level, is a real kind of willfully ignorant beast at the moment. How to address that, I'm not sure, but I do think that any of us who kind of are engaging in activism really need to be thinking about editors and their decisions and what they're willing to let through, particularly from columnists.
Thanks very much, Eliz. That's very helpful. I think as you were talking there, I was thinking about that thing about climate delayism, and remembering the common chant of climate protesters, which is system change, not climate change, right? And it seems like there's actually very little appetite for engaging with what that means in almost any UK journalism at the moment. I should also mention that links to several of the sources that Eliz mentioned, including Eliz's article in the Byline Times and some of the Carbon Brief reporting, are in the description of this video. So feel free to have a look. And I'm going to pass on now to Donnachadh to talk a little bit more about the questions of ownership and leadership in the UK media. Donnachadh, take it away.
Yeah, many thanks, Rowan. Thanks for the invitation. I believe that this issue of what's the role of the media in the climate emergency is the existential question of our time. We are, as the UN says, in code red alert. We are facing accelerating carbon emissions rather than decreasing carbon emissions, and we have passed the danger zone. So I've come to this. I've spent 30 years as a climate and ecological campaigner activist. I've ended up in many different roles across from being deputy chair of Liberal Democrats to writing books about green lifestyle to being an eco-auditor to working with Extinction Rebellion. So I've kind of seen, I've been a local councillor. I've seen the climate movement for 30 years. And with that experience, I believe the single biggest issue that the climate movement has failed to address is the role of the media. I remember looking at the American Petroleum Institute. They produced a strategy around, I think it's around 20 years ago to basically, they pulled together the oil industry and said, how are we going to protect ourselves? And what is our top target? And they decided destruction of the Kyoto Treaty was their target. And they produced an extraordinary strategic plan published in the New York Times outlining that. What were the goals? What are the targets? How did they achieve and what would be success? In some ways, I feel the climate movement has failed to reflect that in our strategic thinking. We have millions of people active around the world. We have thousands of organizations. But who has ever looked at what is the strategic role and how do we win? How do we save humanity? And I would argue what that strategic thinking involves is that what does the fossil fuel industry look like? I'd say there's 4 pillars for that. Those 4 pillars are government, which sets the regulatory framework for the fossil fuel industry. It's the oil industry, which obviously produces the fossil fuels. It's the banks that finance the industry. And finally, and the most important one, it's the media that provides the social and political permission for the other 3 pillars to operate to maintain the fossil fuel economy. So having set out the strategic structure of the fossil fuel economy, what is the structure of the climate movement in tackling that? And I would argue, historically, the climate movement has focused on 3 pillars. We focused on trying to change government. We focused on trying to change business. And we focused on trying to change civil society in our own personal actions. But we have failed to actually address the 4th pillar, the 4th estate. Not, I mean, as going to them as persuading journalists to do better articles or please cover us better, but actually looking at them as a singular pillar of power, that if they were on our side, I believe passionately that the other 3 pillars of the fossil fuel economy would fall and they would convert to supporting humanity rather than helping its destruction. And I think it's this failure by the climate movement to address the role of the media in the climate in the emergency is the one that we need to most urgently address and tackle. So in the United Kingdom, Eliz reference to ownership and editors. I think the role of editors is secondary to the role of the structure of media ownership in the United Kingdom and in many other parts of the world. Why do I say that? Because in the United Kingdom, it's the owners who appoint the editors. And that's where the real power lies in the United Kingdom. Doing protests outside Parliament Square or outside Barclays or HSBC, we're tackling secondary sources of power. The real sources of power are the owners of the major media organizations in the UK. And now you say, well, a lot of these aren't actually anti-climate action. They're just, either covering it or supporting it to a certain extent. But if you look at the ownership of the Times, the Mail, the GB News, Talk TV, etc., we've got around 4 or 5 billionaires who are very clearly left, are not just Tory, but they're actually UKIP. Their politics are so far to the right, we actually don't have a Tory press any longer. It's a UKIP press and it's a climate action delaying and obstruction press. And the problem is those owners. And that's a problem for the entire ecosystem because through them, they have bullied the BBC for around 20, 30 years. Their attacks of the BBC is cowered by them. And it sets the tone of what the BBC covers, because the BBC opens the papers in the morning, the producers open the papers in the morning, they say, what shall we cover? And so the framing is set by these people. And I just want to give you examples of how some evidence for the power that lies there. So, for example, many, many years ago in the mid-90s, I was on the board of the Liberal Democrats. And I was very anxious as a newly elected board member that the party should advocate on European issues in European elections. So when the next European election came up and I was on the board, I said, I hope we're going to concentrate on European elections in this campaign and not to make it into a national referendum on domestic politics. The response really chilled me, because the response came back from the head of campaigns saying very clearly that if the party campaigned on European issues in European elections, Murdoch would destroy us. And I said there and then, that was the mid-90s, I said, well, if ever there's a referendum on European issues, if the party that's supposed to be in favour of European integration is afraid of campaigning on European issues in European elections, then we've already lost that campaign. And that gives a tiny example of, at the top of British politics, the power of our right-wing media ownership. A second example is that almost every single Prime Minister for the last 50 years has been endorsed by Murdoch or by the Daily Mail. The only exception in 50 years was Sunak, and he was their first choice a year previously, and it's only when Truss, their installed choice, self-destructed, that Sunak inherited the role of Prime Minister. So every single Prime Minister has been endorsed by these 2 to 3 people owning our media. That's the real power. Next example, and bring it closer to the climate issue. There's 9 million people this winter suffering from colder homes and higher bills and cost of living crisis for one reason and one reason only. And that's because in 2012, the coalition government was installing 2.4 million insulation in 2.4 million homes every year in 2012. Then Lord Lawson from the Global Policy Foundation took Paul Dacker, the editor of the Daily Mail, out to lunch and said, you must wage war on the green crap from the Tories, quote unquote. And Dacker went back to the Mail and did that for the next 6 months. As a result of that, Osborne and Cameron destroyed the green crap, as they called it, and the insulation program was destroyed, and it's now less than 100,000. So we went from 2.4 million a year to less than 100,000. That has meant 9 million homes, which would have been insulated in the last 10 years, weren't. And that's the price paid by one paper, one media editor, one owner, waging war on climate action in the United Kingdom. And another example is England is the only country in the world that has the madcap policy of banning the cheapest form of renewable energy, onshore wind. It was instigated in 2015. Why? Because a major campaign in the Barclay-owned Telegraph and the Rothermere-owned Daily Mail waged war on wind turbines, and Cameron caved and banned them, and the ban is still in place 8 years later. And I just want, on the evidence front, I want to reference some work that Eliz did with us, with Climate Media Coalition. And I think this is really, really important, because the link between what the media covers, public opinion and government policy, is quite important. Because we have to remember, despite this flood of information that Eliz enunciated and Carbon Brief has outlined, 80% of the British public still believes urgent action is needed on the climate front and believe the government isn't taking sufficient action. So here we have a situation where the public wants action, the media doesn't want action. What does the government do? So after the Ukraine war, the government announced an energy security review. And so what we did is with Eliz, we analysed, we looked at what did the public support on 8 issues on terms of energy? What did the newspapers back in their columns and editorials? And what did the government decide? And so what we looked at was onshore wind, offshore wind, nuclear fusion, insulation, solar, North Sea oil expansion, and fracking. We found the public in large majorities supported onshore wind, supported offshore wind, opposed nuclear, didn't know enough about fusion, supported insulation, supported solar, opposed North Sea oil, and opposed fracking. The media took the opposite view on every single one of those issues on public, other than on offshore wind, where they did support offshore wind. But the media supported nuclear, supported fusion, opposed insulation, opposed solar, supported North Sea oil, supported fracking, and supported onshore and opposed onshore wind. So what did the government decide in its energy policy when it produced it? The only thing the government adopted that the public supported in large numbers was offshore wind, which the media also supported. Every other single policy item was decided in favour of what the media wanted and not what the public wanted. So to conclude, what I am saying is that the media is the most important issue of our time in terms of the existential crisis of climate. Obviously, it has huge issues on all the other social issues and environmental issues and democratic issues of our time. But unless we address the issue of media ownership and its attack on climate action, we are in danger, not only in the United Kingdom, but globally, of failing to save humanity. And one final point just on the case of what's happened. Last year, in the 6 months leading up to COP26, the Mail and the Sun and the Telegraph waged war on climate action by the UK government on the global scale. And that led to a budget prior to COP26, where their Sunak didn't even mention climate once, 2 months before the COP26. So Johnson and Sharma went into COP26 as the presidency of the COP, the most urgent COP of our lifetime, maybe the last gasp effort to save humanity. And we were the emperor with no clothes because the media demanded that Sunak do nothing on climate, and he did nothing on climate. This is a disaster and it's an emergency. We've got to wake up and do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Donnachadh. Thank you very much. That's, yeah, extremely urgent, as you say, and interesting issues there with media ownership. I guess it does also put me in mind what you were saying about the disparity between public opinion and the media opinion. I think is really interesting, and I think it's something we see more and more in a range of social issues in the past couple of years, particularly in post the arrival of COVID in this country, because I think in particular of the current trade union struggles at the moment and the ways in which, reporting and polling and data seems to suggest most people support the rail strikes, for example. Large proportions of the UK public are perfectly happy for people to go on strike and think they're justified in doing so in this case. A small proportion of the UK population don't, and those tend to be the people who own large media corporations and or are ministers in government. And it's a really interesting parallel there. I think, in some ways it's encouraging, because if I think back to 10 or 15 years ago when, for example, migration was a big issue in the UK press, it felt like the public opinion on migration was much more in the press's corner on that, and worryingly so. But perhaps that changes. It's hard to call it positive, but that disparity between public opinion and press opinion is certainly interesting and shows exactly, as you say, how out of touch with the people they're supposed to represent that people in government and main figures in media are. So speaking about public opinion, and to move us a little bit towards perhaps some thought about ways to counteract these significant problems that we've been talking about, I wanted to bring in Rob to talk about local and community media and potentially your work at Decentred as well. Rob. You take it away.
Thanks. Both of those were really thought-provoking, and I've written a few notes from them, so hopefully I can make some coherent comments. I think there's a couple of things. I think we often describe media as being monolithic, and I think there's a kind of form of industrialized and mass media which we tend to focus on and think of as being very powerful, and it is very powerful, and that kind of is seemingly dominated by a few individuals with a particular ideological approach. But we've seen over the last 20-30 years the rise of tech giants and their role in fueling network-based media, and the newspapers and the news industry have kind of followed that, and so that has been distorted by the algorithmic biases built into Google and Facebook, for example. So it's not quite, they quickly discovered that fueling indignation. The reason the Daily Mail is so successful is it knows how to fuel indignation, and that drives attention and drives the clickbait economy. And unfortunately, I think what we've done in parallel to the climate crisis realization is we've devalued, certainly here in the UK, our media literacies and media skills. So we've seen a kind of parallel trashing of anybody who's ever advocated media studies in the UK. And so we've actually got there's the way I view what Ofcom does, which is supposed to support media literacies within the population, is very consumer oriented. It's very narrow. And the analogy I use for this is like, when you walk into a UK supermarket, there's very little fresh produce, and it's largely dominated by mass produced, industrially produced, factory produced consumer content, which is all very attractive, but is nutritionally deficient. And our media is kind of that kind of a model. And the question is, what do you do about that? Because it's a complex system and a complex set of interlocking systems, some of which are legacy systems, and we give a lot of power to some organizations, or we think that they still retain a lot of power, but actually there are other systems that are at play now which fuel misinformation. And Ofcom produced commissioned a report from Yonder in 21 about misinformation, and it's worth kind of some of the main things that it talked about. It talked to people about how they use their social media to get information and news, and some of the factors that people have. It's a cluttered media landscape. We no longer have one or two, 4 TV channels as I grew up with. We've got hundreds of TV channels. We've got access to things on YouTube and other platforms. So the media landscape itself has changed and diversified. But the skills that we need to navigate that have not kept up. The teaching and the training for people's skills as citizens has not kept up with that. And we don't invest in community media here in the UK and citizens media, DIY media. So one of the things I'm always concerned about is kind of it's how do we navigate our way through this on the basis that we can actually do something about it. And I'm not rejecting a top-down approach. I'm not rejecting a kind of headline approach. I'm not rejecting a mass media approach. What I'm advocating for is a supplementing of a bottom-up approach, if you like, in that we have, for example, about 300 community radio stations in the UK. But what's the purpose they have in promoting understanding of climate change impact in each of those local communities and those places? Who fosters the discussion? And we're seeing at the moment, I think it's an absolute crime, and I think somebody should step in from the government at some point, if they so wish, to stop the BBC from decimating BBC local radio in England, where they're cutting services. So where are the opportunities that people have to foster local discussion, foster local civic exchange and deliberation? And I think we can, the work I do and the work I kind of advocate for is to, with many others, is to try and advocate for a form of media which is owned and controlled by people themselves, where we can raise issues and learn. So it's seen as a learning process, and it's kind of, the example I often use. I walk around, my neighbourhood, and you see people sat in their cars with the engine idling, whether they're on the phone or something like that. There's no reason to have their engine idling, and yet you think, what is going to change that person's attitude and approach to, the using their car, minimizing their carbon emissions? And we've got to use the tools and techniques that we've got to hand. But I think one of the policy changes that we've got to make is kind of get rid of the gatekeepers. We've become a very centralized media economy. There are, how many major corporations now own radio stations and independent commercial radio stations in the UK? A handful. You can't, we have newspapers, and we kind of need to break that up and go back to one of the things I talked about through Better Media is the idea of a localism test. It's bandied about. What makes something local media? Well, you can fake and simulate that local media from something which is just networked, and you drop it. I read my local newspaper, the Leicester Mercury, and it's got stories that are just clickbait stories pulled from a server, sandwiched between them are occasional local reports from the courts and the traffic updates. It's not really what makes something genuinely local. And I have despite the cynicism of the right-wing agenda, I have a kind of faith, maybe misplaced faith, maybe, in once you get people sitting around talking about the things that they need to deal with and that they need to challenge, then actually you can move through. It's it's not an easy process. So things like low traffic neighbourhoods are very contentious at the moment, and there's we've seen the reports from Oxford about kind of it. Some people, it's polarizing and the way it's discussed, but we don't have a model of media which is about bringing people together to share and exchange and take the time to learn about each other's position and to bring people in who are not otherwise represented in the discussions. So, for example, here in Leicester, we've got a neighbourhood with a low traffic area being kind of developed through the local authority, and lots of people are very contentious about it. However, I asked the question, whose voices are not heard in this discussion? There's no children being represented in these discussions. Our local political reporter talks about the protest group that turns up at the local council meeting, but doesn't go out and talk to local school children, or doesn't talk to pensioners, or doesn't talk to disabled people, or doesn't talk to people who are non-car users, and talks about the quality of life. So I think I'd sum it, for me, I'd kind of sum it up as, what are the practical things that we can do to help people learn to change? Now, I'm not a behaviourist. I'm not in favour of nudge theory. And we've spent, the government's spending something like £18 million on adverts, which plastered across social media, about teaching people to turn their heating down at the moment. I think that money would have been better spent supporting community media and the Bristol Cable and the Manchester Meteor to actually develop purposeful content, solutions-focused content, accountable content, local content, because we're going to have to build this infrastructure that enables civic literacy, civic engagement, rather than just waiting. We're never going to get Murdoch to change. We're never going to get the Daily Mail to change. They know exactly what their market is. They know exactly how to make money out of that market. But we're kind of maybe going to have to advocate for building around that and getting back into our communities to build the skills for people to talk and discuss things themselves. I might be an optimist and romantic when it comes to this idea. But I think, that's really the only way, and it's going to be a long haul. But, the IPCC report said that we're going to need, structural change right the way through society. And that's going to have to include our media if we're going to deal with climate crisis.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, again, system change, not climate change, right, is what comes to mind. But I certainly agree with you. I think there was an interesting point raised in the chat here about media ownership laws, and I wonder, with your sentiment there, that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to change the behaviour and the actions of the Murdoch media. I wonder if what the panelists think about the potential for legal intervention in terms of ownership models, for example, restrictions on the amount of publications that can be owned, or things like the intervention over Sky that we saw several years ago with Murdoch, that kind of thing. I'd be interested to hear what any of you think about whether that is a useful avenue to explore.
I'll let Donnachadh speak to that, really, but one thing that I would just like to say on the B Sky B bid is that I don't know a huge amount about it, but I did just read Nick Davies' book about the investigating that he did to reveal the phone hacking scandal, and certainly his opinion is that really the B Sky B bid was caught in very good time by the phone hacking scandal, and that had it not been for the phone hacking scandal breaking at exactly the same time that the B Sky B bid was kind of going through, and they were eking it out, and there was back and forth, between Jeremy Hunt, who I think was the culture secretary at the time, I can't remember, but he was certainly very much involved, and the people behind the scenes at News Corp. they were getting to a place, it seemed, where they were going to allow it to go through. And then the phone hacking scandal happened and everything got thrown up in the air, and they went, well, look, public opinion is never going to let us do this now because everyone hates you. And, I think if it wasn't for that, we might be looking at a completely different situation now. Other than that, though, I'm really interested to hear what Donnachadh has to say, particularly about the legal structures of ownership and potential interventions.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right about BSkyB. The Guardian's work on hacking at the time was absolutely crucial in blocking that. However, I would say that we're now facing the BSkyB situation yet again, writ large, because Murdoch is, if anything, he's amazingly persistent. I have to give him the admiration that he just keeps going decade after decade. He has a very clear agenda. Actually, I would argue all five media billionaires have a very clear manifesto that they have been gradually working through in British politics, democracy, for around 50 years. They're against environmental regulation. They wanted to get rid of European issue. They want to get rid of environmental regulations. They want to get rid of workers' striking rights. They want to get rid of the Human Rights Convention, and they want to privatize the NHS. And they want to get rid of the BBC, and they want an end to public services and privatize most public services. They have been working on that agenda for around 50 years. They are consistent. It's a very clear manifesto. It's a major political party run by an oligarchy that nobody really addresses, in my view, strategically. So, I wanted to respond to what you said, Eliz, is that we stopped it with BSkyB. But with GB News and with Talk TV, they are recreating it. And these are not just, these are to the right of, these are OAN. These are not, this is not Fox News. It's to the right of Fox News that we've got. It's pumping out anti-worker, anti-environmental regulation, anti-climate action, anti-democratic views all day, daily. That's, in my view, they're platforming Reform, UKIP. And that's why UKIP and Reform are going up in the popularity. And that restricts the Tory party's ability to be a mainstream party, because they have now to cope with an increasingly empowered, promoted extreme right. But going back to the question you posed to me, sorry, what should we do structurally? If we were able to have a government that was free of the media oligarchy, you would do two things. One is you'd say, the fourth estate is a crucial part of British democracy. So why on earth do we allow our fourth estate to be owned by billionaires not located in the country? That amount of power handed away to 4 or 5 individuals owning GB News, Talk TV, and the major media, and then their power on government policy and on the BBC and on public opinion, is unacceptable in a so-called liberal democracy. So that's the first thing I think we need to do, is actually address that ownership of the fourth estate should be within Britain. And the second one, I think, is a more constructive response to Rob's contribution, which I agree completely. We need a wide ecosystem from local to regional to national news if we're going to have a properly informed public, and then that leading to well-informed politics and well-informed decision-making by our various levels of government. So how do we do that? Now, it's very interesting. It's something Murdoch achieved in Australia, but for different ends. Murdoch persuaded the Australian government to introduce a social media tax. And that was said that needs to fund news gathering. So most of the money goes to Murdoch. Which is very clever, but it just shows you can get such a tax through government. And that tax could be distributed by, let's say, a national media authority to fund news gathering and news reporting from a wider ecosystem than the narrow billionaire offshore oligarchy that currently controls our media. And that could fund an ecosystem at local, regional, and national level that's independent of the media oligarchy and restore some semblance of liberal democracy to the United Kingdom. So those are the two legal issues, I think, if in an ideal world we had a government that wasn't appointed by the media oligarchy, should implement. And the final point I want to make is Rob was talking about public opinion and Eliz was talking about opinion, and so are you, Rowan. I think the crucial point I want to make on that is public opinion's there on so many issues, but it's the link between the front page of the Sun and the Mail and government policy. I think you also need to remember that there are more people in the Tory party, parliamentary party, very committed to climate action than there are those opposed to it. The Global Warming Policy Foundation group, around 30 to 40 MPs. But those are the ones that are constantly highlighted in the Mail and the Sun and the right-wing media, and then that influences public policy. We have to remember, climate action is cross-party. It has to be if we're going to save ourselves. But the vast majority of every political party in Parliament supports climate action, but all of them are terrified of taking the actions that will incur the anger of the Mail and the Sun and the GB News. And that link between their political power to assert government policy as opposed to public opinion is crucial to this debate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to note that we have about 10 minutes left, so time plenty for some discussion. If anyone in the chat wants to contribute questions, please do. And Eliz or Rob, if you'd like to come in response to what Donnachadh was saying, looks like Eliz would like to. Go ahead.
I would love to come back to a couple of things Donnachadh said just very quickly, which is that one, I think the Australian example is a really good example and is something that Canada is currently working on, and they're hopefully going to be looking at the mistakes made by the Australian government. And there was a recently a report that's just come out from DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, that featured the cable really heavily and what we're doing in Bristol. And one of the things it said was that, those kinds of taxes, those kinds of levies could be put, in to basically get money from the government for local media, particularly local media rather than national media, and do that without any kind of worry about editorial control from, the state, the influence of the state. In America, there's a new campaign called Reclaim Local News, which is arguing for the same things. So, for example, if you are a local newspaper and you hire journalists from your local area, rather than being a newspaper like a company like Reach, which publishes, like Rob was saying, all of these random clickbait articles, and they go across all Reach publications that are supposedly local. If you basically get like a subsidy or a tax levy or whatever for hiring local journalists for local papers. And I would just also plug the cable, because I think what we're doing is quite unique. We have a membership model. We also get some grant funding, and we're really trying to build our membership in Bristol. You can pay as little as £1 a month or as much as you like. And obviously we try and advocate as much as you like, but it's one member, one vote. And so the people who are our members do actually own the paper, and they get to vote at our AGM on what we cover, how we cover it, what they think about the paper. They don't have day-to-day editorial decisions, but they do influence the way that we run and the things that we do, and we're accountable to them. So sorry, I will let you talk, Rob, because I'm aware that I've butted a few times.
No, I mean, you actually said a lot of the things I was about to say, which is great. But I always have this thing of kind of, I gave evidence at the House of Lords last year for the future of the BBC and how the BBC is paid. And one of the points I made there was, why are we waiting for the BBC to change? Why are we waiting for Murdoch to change? We've kind of got to roll our sleeves up and get in and produce and create this new media ecosystem, put together things like the cable, put community radio stations together, set up our podcasts, start our blogs, start our video channels, because there is you can build an alternative ecosystem around it. And those people who are, join Better Media and will lobby for that decentralized process. I have concerns, and have had concerns for a long time, about the local democracy reporter scheme, because the vast majority of the money went to Reach and the large corporates, and they're profit-making organisations. Why are they getting public? So I'm not a communist. I believe in markets and capitalism in a regulated manner, and unfortunately, the capitalists are taking public subsidy when they should be taking the risks in the marketplace. Now, if their consumers want this awful media, that's fine, but that's a small, narrow element of the population that, as Donnachadh says, it sucks up of all of our attention, and we believe it's more powerful than it is. And so our politics is skewed by the attention management of these issues. And maybe what we need to do is kind of start to rebuild an infrastructure around it. And we have to do it one organization, one group at a time, one issue at a time, because it kind of, it's, I think the one of the fundamental issues at the heart of this is trust. And I have a phrase which I use a lot about community media, that is that it travels at the speed of trust. And nobody trusts our media, and nobody trusts our news and information and journalism. So people are very skeptical. They're holding things back. And in the meantime, things are, other people come in and they take ownership and they take control of things. So we've got to bring people together to say, yes, we're committed to supporting independent news, independent media, in whatever form that takes, and decentralizing it so it passes a local testing. I just don't understand how Ofcom has passed through all of the consolidation of radio stations in the last 10 years. It's just, how's that happened without any reference back to citizens to see if this is what you want? How is the BBC? They've produced no public information that justifies the changes that they're making to BBC local radio. There's no public engagement. It's scandalous, but they've just got this executive management model, because the executives are probably chasing jobs in Netflix and wherever else for their next career move. And it's, as citizens, we're left out in the cold with this. So for me, it's about citizen participation as well. And to do that, you have to have the hard grind of establishing independent, locally owned, locally run, locally accountable, locally trusted, whatever form of media it is, whether it's commercial or community, so that we can actually start to rebalance some of this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. A couple of things that people have just said put me in mind of the Independent Media Association, which is a group in this country that brings together independent media publications to use their collective power to the extent that they can. We were talking about, Donnachadh in particular was talking a lot about just how much power the right-wing media represent. And on the topic of power, again, the current union struggles come up, right? You think the big employers at, in the railway space, in communications at Royal Mail, etc., that are currently in dispute with unions have a lot of power, but also the union apparatus exists to allow people workers to exercise their power collectively as well. And I think that's something that we struggle with a bit in terms of climate, is having those same models to directly exercise the collective power that we do have. And with regard to the Independent Media Association, they have been collating some opinions from within the sector about what to do about upcoming media legislation in this country. We talked about the Australian example, which is bizarre and fascinating, and I recommend people read about it. The bit where Mark Zuckerberg threw a hissy fit and turned off Facebook for all of Australia for a couple of days is just incredible. But the issue of dealing with how big tech present news, which is generally they snip it from other people's websites and then just paste it as their own stuff, and how to get them to compensate news websites for that. That was the basic idea in Australia, and then Murdoch hijacked the process and made it his own. And so all that money goes to him, as you were saying. And a similar thing could happen here. And I think, Donnachadh, you said these are the things we should do if we had a government that was in any way credibly democratic. And factually, we don't, right? And that they are going to do these things anyway. There's a media bill due out at some point this summer, probably, maybe later in the year, which has all been up in the air with the questions about Channel 4 and so on. But there are going to be provisions in that deal with these kind of issues relating to how news media is owned and communicated online. And that is another place where the Tories will probably take the opportunity to step on independent media in favour of their oligarchic friends. So the organisation of independent media with things like the Independent Media Association, Public Interest News Foundation is really important. And I would recommend that people look up those organisations, engage with their work as well. We've just got a couple more minutes. Is there anything else anyone would like to come in on just before we wrap up here? Yeah, please, Donnachadh.
Are you okay? Do you want to say something, Liz? Sorry, I jumped in there.
Please.
Yeah, I was just thought that you just talked about whether we have a democratic government or not, and the fact that every single prime minister, whether Labour or Tory, has been approved by the Murdoch-Thacker oligarchy. I think people, we've seen, whatever your politics are over the last 10 years, what happened to, for the last 20 years in terms of the Labour Party. It's seen as a battle between the Corbynists and the Blairites. And it's kind of, I would argue that battle is not between a right-wing and a left-wing section of the Labour Party, but it's between those in the Labour Party who said that if Labour is going to accede to power, it has to neutralise Murdoch and Thacker, and those who actually think it should be a genuine political party. Now, whatever your views of what Labour, what an independent Labour Party would stand for as a social democratic party, but to my mind, the political analysis of what's going on in the Labour Party is a battle between how do we deal with the Murdoch-Thacker oligarchy? Do we have a policy of acceding to them, or do we have a policy of standing up and saying this is who we are? I would say John Smith and Jeremy Corbyn said we need to be an independent political party setting in a democratic agenda in a proper liberal democracy. I would argue Starmer and Blair said no, we have to neutralise Murdoch and Thacker if we're going to win. And that to me is chilling, and that to me is the reality, and it's the reality I don't think we talk about enough. And I think going back over, all of my work, I have dealt with so many of the pillars of power in the United Kingdom, from the Corporation of London through major corporations to political parties to the environmental movement itself. And I keep coming across fear. You talked about trust, Rob, for local democracy. I talk about fear, and often it's an unconscious and unspoken fear. They won't act because they're terrified of what the male son Murdoch oligarchy will do to them, and that transfixes and freezes action right across the political spectrum, right across government, right across civil society, because civil society doesn't know it's happening or isn't conscious of it. And so my final thing is, whatever part of the climate movement you're in, whether it's media, government, civil society, or business, whatever you do over the next 2 years, please think of including how do we address the media, how do we deal, what does the role of the media in the climate emergency is, because that is the existential question.
That's great. I think that's a really important note to end on. Thank you, Donnachadh. I'll just quickly say some last thanks and plug a couple of things to finish up. So thanks again, the three of you, for being here with me today for this discussion, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. For those of you watching, usually on YouTube, people ask you to like and subscribe. I'm not going to do that. I'm instead going to ask you to go and see our Open Collective page, which is where you can learn about how you can support Better Media and the work that we do. And there's links in the description, and I believe somebody has put it in the chat for us. Thank you. And also, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel in perpetuity, so please share it with anybody who wasn't able to be with us today and maybe think they'd be interested. And then lastly, if you're interested in more conversations like this, I'd encourage you to look up the Media Democracy Festival, which is taking place on March 25th in London, run by the Media Reform Coalition, who, with one of my other hats on, I do some work for. Yeah, I'd recommend you look into that as well. I think that will wrap us up. Thanks again very much to everybody.